Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the foundational realities of U.S. westward expansion. Now, we're going to examine this massive historical shift, but not through the usual lens of frontier battles. Instead, we're looking at the paperwork, the legal frameworks, and the systemic, bureaucratic processes that actually made it happen. And we're kicking things off with a surprising look at a famous real estate deal that kind of set the stage for everything that followed.
So picture this, it's the spring of 1803, and the United States literally doubles its size overnight in a single transaction we all know as the Louisiana Purchase. And they got it for a total bargain, just $15 million. But when you actually look closer at the documents, there's this fascinating twist. The U.S. wasn't actually buying the land itself from France because, well, France didn't even own it to begin with. What the U.S. really bought for that $15 million was a legal concept called imperial rights. It essentially meant that France agreed to completely back off and stay out of the way, allowing this new American empire to negotiate directly with the hundreds, if not thousands, of native tribes who actually lived there, who had been there for millennia and who rightfully owned the land. You see, early American leaders were actually hyper-aware of this reality. They absolutely did not want to act like the brutal European empires they just fought a war to escape from. They wanted to avoid a legacy of pure military conquest. Instead, their new USA plan was to acquire this vast territory fairly and squarely through negotiations, formal treaties, and fair payments. We're talking about offering things like food, cash, and farming equipment in exchange for land deeds. George Washington himself actually set the tone for this, famously declaring that the U.S. government's administration would be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity. I mean, this was a nation whose founding documents were all about liberty and welfare, right? So they genuinely wanted their expansion to look like a peaceful, highly civilized, transactional process, at least on paper. Which brings us to part one, the facade of justice, and what happens when those peaceful transactions fail. Unsurprisingly, when the U.S. showed up to sovereign tribes offering plows and blacksmith services in exchange for their ancestral homelands, a lot of tribes simply said, no thanks. They obviously had zero interest in packing up and leaving the places they'd lived for generations. But as the U.S. population started booming, the demand for land skyrocketed, and Washington's noble ideals evaporated pretty quickly. The historical sources show the government using some incredibly dark bureaucratic tactics to get the land anyway. They were getting tribal leaders drunk to trick them into signing away territory, literally appointing random individuals as fake leaders to sign for entire tribes. And when the paperwork tricks didn't work, they immediately pivoted to the threat and the reality of military violence. If you trace the historical record, it reveals this incredibly rapid timeline of broken promises. Up near the Great Lakes, tribes refused to sell, defended a river border, and held their ground until the U.S. finally won a third battle and just took all of present-day Ohio. Down in Florida, the military forced the Seminoles into swamps, completely cutting them off from their farms in the ocean. Over in Alabama, settlers overran the borders just 4 years after a signed peace treaty, prompting the military to force the Muskogee out entirely. And out in the Dakotas, the U.S. totally ignored a hard-fought peace treaty with the Sioux and Arapaho the exact moment gold was discovered. Let's move into part two, the Cotton Kingdom and the 5 civilized tribes. This whole legal framework of treaties, it was put to the ultimate test in the Deep South. Here, you had 5 large nations, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, living side by side with settlers. They had existing treaties that acknowledged their land rights, and they had heavily assimilated into the encroaching culture. I mean, many spoke English, practiced European-style farming, wore European clothes, some even owned slaves. Because of all this, they were historically referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. But there was a problem. The U.S. desperately wanted their land, specifically this incredibly fertile strip called the Black Belt Prairie, so they could expand their highly profitable cotton empire. The state of Georgia became aggressively determined to push the Cherokee off that prime cotton land, going so far as to pass laws that literally abolished the Cherokee government. But the Cherokee didn't just go to war. In this incredible historical twist, they fought back using the exact same bureaucratic tools the U.S. prided itself on. They actually took their case against the state of Georgia all the way to the Supreme Court. And this brilliantly illustrates the real tension of this era, because the Cherokee won. The highest court in the United States looked at the treaties, looked at the law, and ruled that the Cherokee Nation had ironclad rights to their land. They said states like Georgia absolutely could not impose on tribal sovereignty. It was a massive victory on paper, one that really tested whether this young nation would actually follow its own rule of law. Which leads us perfectly into part 3, Jackson defies the court.
Now, as you probably remember from basic civics, a judicial ruling is just words on paper unless the executive branch actually enforces it. And at that time, the executive branch was controlled by President Andrew Jackson, a guy who once boasted in a letter about slaughtering 170 Native Americans in elegant style. When the Supreme Court validated the Cherokees' rights, Jackson chillingly defied Chief Justice John Marshall. He reportedly stated, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." So, instead of enforcing the law of the land, Jackson pushes his own vision through Congress, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This legislation officially orchestrated a massive, taxpayer-funded campaign to push these First Americans out of the East and relocate them all to the Great Plains. You have to understand, at the time, this Western territory was viewed by Eastern settlers as just a completely uninhabitable dumping ground. And it came with this incredibly hollow promise that if the tribes moved there, they would literally never be bothered again. Yet, even right in the middle of this forced relocation, the U.S. government somehow kept up the charade of justice. The actual text of the law still claimed they would forever secure and guarantee this new land and negotiate voluntarily. They just kept generating this massive paper trail of fake treaties, so the public felt the whole process was completely legal. Like in the Cherokees case, the U.S. ultimately accepted a binding signature on a removal treaty from a Cherokee individual who had absolutely zero authority to sign for the tribe. They completely ignored the furious protests of the actual Cherokee chief. But, if they had a signature on a piece of paper, they deemed it legally justified. All of this relentless bureaucracy brings us to part 4, the Trail of Tears. This massive push, the laws, the fake signatures, the defied court rulings, it all culminated in a staggering historical metric. Over the course of almost a century, the United States signed 368 treaties with tribal nations. Think about that immense amount of statecraft and paperwork. Yet almost every single one of those 368 treaties ultimately resulted in the tribes being driven out to make way for settlers. Focusing back on the South, the strict enforcement of Jackson's policies meant that nearly every single member of the 5 civilized tribes was entirely expelled. We are talking about 100,000 individual human beings. That's roughly the population of an entire modern city, just systematically removed from the only home they had ever known. These 100,000 people were forced to walk by foot for more than 1,000 miles. They had to endure brutal weather and incredibly harsh terrain, heading toward this newly drawn box on a map they'd never even seen. It was a deadly, forced march that the Cherokee would eventually call the Trail Where We Cried, which is more commonly known today as the Trail of Tears. So here's the crucial takeaway from all of this. What happened during the westward expansion wasn't just some random, chaotic frontier violence. It was a highly organized, state-sponsored campaign of removal. It was systematic. It was fully enshrined in the law of the land. And it was documented meticulously in receipts, in treaties, and in 19th century spreadsheets by a nation that was desperately trying to convince itself it was acting with justice. And when you dig into the historical sources, you find something genuinely chilling. This bureaucratic process of displacement was so well documented and so effective that a century later, it served as a dark blueprint. Adolf Hitler actually explicitly referenced this exact American historical event as an inspiration for his own atrocities in Europe. He literally stated that the Volga River in Russia would be our Mississippi, taking the mechanics of American expansion and turning it into a model for his own agenda. Which leaves us staring at a pretty profound question to end our explainer today. We've seen exactly how the United States set out to be different from the old empires, relying on paper instead of just swords. But as we reflect on this history, we really have to ask, how can the very tools meant to ensure humanity, our treaties, our laws, our courts, and our paperwork, be so perfectly twisted into a pristine facade for conquest? Thank you for tuning in, and keep questioning the documents that shape our world.